Good afternoon. Today we're going to look at chapters 9 and 11, looking at class and caste system within Latin America, as well as the Bourbon reforms. The casta system in colonial Latin America created a complex racial hierarchy that shaped society. Europeans held the highest positions while the indigenous and African population faced discrimination and exploitation. This system determined social status, economic opportunities, and legal rights for different racial groups. Race categories, like mestizos and mulattoes, occupied an intermediate status in the hierarchy. Despite some advantages over indigenous and African populations, they still face barriers to advancement. The casta system reinforced racial inequalities and limited social mobilities for non European groups. The casta system classified individuals into racial categories based on their ancestry and phenotypic characteristics. Racial categorization determined social status, economic opportunities, and legal rights in Spanish colonial society. Social stratification created a hierarchical structure with Europeans at the top and indigenous and African populations at the bottom. Pigmentocracy privileged lighter skin tones and European features, associating them with higher social status and privilege. Limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, emphasized the importance of European ancestry and the absence of either Jewish, Muslim, or African heritage. The caste system reinforced racial inequalities and limited social mobilities for non European populations. Racial categorization influenced access to education, occupations, and political power. Mixed race individuals, mestizos, mulattos, zambos, occupied an intermediate status in the hierarchy. They faced discrimination and barriers to advancement despite their partial European ancestry. The casta system, or caste system, justified the exploitation and marginalization of indigenous and African populations. Forced labor systems like the encomienda, el repartimiento, esclavitud, or slavery, relied on racial hierarchies to extract labor and resources. Now, the peninsulares, or peninsulars, were individuals born in Spain who held the highest positions in colonial administration and in the Catholic Church. They enjoyed the greatest privileges and power in colonial society due to their direct connection to the Spanish crown. They monopolized key governmental positions, viceroys, governors, judges, and controlled the transcontinental trade. They viewed themselves as superior to criollos and other colonial subjects, often discriminating against them. Criollos were descendants of Spanish settlers born in the Americas. They held significant wealth and influence as landowners, merchants, and professionals, lawyers, doctors. They resented the privileges and power of the peninsulares, leading to tensions and rivalries between the two groups. And they played a crucial role in the development of colonial culture and identity. Colonial Latin America's social structure was rigid, but people found ways to climb the ladder. Buying whiteness certificates, passing as higher class, and getting educated were key strategies. Wealth and smart marriages could also boost social standing. But the system had built in roadblocks. Job restrictions, limited land ownership, and discriminatory laws kept many people down. The elite guarded their power, making it tough for others to break through. Now, on to the Bourbon reforms. The Bourbon reforms were implemented in the 18th century by the Spanish Bourbon or Bourbon monarchy, aimed to modernize and centralized the administration of the Spanish Empire. It was influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, which emphasized reason, progress, and individual rights. It occurred in the context of increasing competition from other European powers, particularly Britain and France, for control over colonial territories and trade routes. Spain sought to reassert its authority and increase revenue from its colonies in the Americas. The reforms coincided with the reign of several Bourbon monarchs, including Philip V, Ferdinand VI, and Charles III. Now, the motivations of the reforms was the need to address the declining power and influence of the Spanish Empire on the global stage. It aimed to strengthen the economy, military, and bureaucracy of the Spanish colonies. A series of administrative, economic, and social reforms were implemented by the Spanish Bourbon monarchy in the 18th century. It aimed to modernize the Spanish Empire and increase revenue from the colonies. It focused on centralizing power in the hands of the monarchy and reducing the influence of the local elites. It included measures to promote economic development, such as the liberalization of trade and the establishment of new industries. It sought to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of colonial administration through the creation of new bureaucratic institutions, and attempted to assert greater control over the Catholic Church and limit its power in the colonies. Now, there were resistance to the reforms. It was met with resistance from some segments of colonial society, particularly whose interests were threatened by the reforms. Opposition from the local elites, such as the criollos or Creole aristocracy and the clergy, who saw their power and privileges threatened by the reforms. The formation of the 1967 Criollo conspiracy against the Bourbon reforms in New Spain were led by the Marquis of Valle Oaxaca. Resistance from indigenous communities also faced increased taxation, land encroachment, and cultural assimilation. For example, the rebellion of Tupac Amaru II in Peru between 1780 and 81, which sought to overthrow Spanish rule and restore Inca sovereignty. There was criticism from some Enlightenment thinkers who saw the reforms as insufficient or inconsistent with their ideals. Now, the consequences of the reforms were the emergence of new forms of political consciousness and the identity among the Criollo population. It also had the development of a distinct Criollo identity that emphasized the cultural and historical differences between the colonies and Spain. You had an intensification of social and racial tensions, as the reforms often benefited the white elite at the expense of other groups. Sporadic outbreaks of violence and unrest, particularly in rural areas and among indigenous communities, occurred. Then you also had the gradual erosion of the legitimacy and authority of the Spanish crown in the eyes of many colonial subjects. It contributed to the growth of the distinct Criollo identity and political consciousness that would later fuel the independence movements of the early 19th century. It laid the groundwork for the development of more centralized and bureaucratic state structures in the post-independence period. At the same time, it accelerated the process of economic modernization and integration into the global capitalist system. For example, the expansion of cash crop production and the growth of export-oriented economies, and increased dependence on foreign trade and investment, particularly from Britain and the US. Lastly, you had intensified social and racial inequalities, as the reforms often benefited the white elite at the expense of indigenous and mixed race populations. Moreover, it contributed to the secularization of society and the weakening of the Catholic Church's influence in public life. This sparked a renewed interest in the pre-Hispanic past and the development of a distinct Latin American cultural identity. You had the emergence of Indigenismo, a cultural and political movement that sought to valorize indigenous cultures and histories, and it set the stage for the political and economic challenges that would face the newly independent Latin American nations in the 19th century. Struggles over the nature and extent of state power, regional autonomy, and social and economic reform, and ongoing tensions between the liberal and conservative visions of national development and identities. Now, Brazil actually reacted to the reforms in a particular way. Brazil was a colony of Portugal from the early 16th century until its independence in 1822. Portuguese colonizers initially focused on extracting valuable resources such as Brazil wood, sugar, and gold from Brazil. The Spanish crowns implemented a system of hereditary captaincy, capitanias herendias, in the 1530s to encourage settlement and development. The captaincies were large land grants given to Portuguese nobility who were responsible for colonizing and administrating the territories. Plantation agriculture, particularly sugar production, became a key feature of Brazil's colonial economy, relying heavily on enslaved labor. The discovery of gold in the late 17th century in Minas Gerais led to a gold rush and a shift in the colony's economic focus. The Spanish crown maintained strict control over Brazil, implementing mercantilist policies to ensure the colony's resources benefited the metropolis. The Marquis of Pombal, a powerful Portuguese statesman, implemented reforms in the mid 18th century aimed at modernizing and centralizing the administration of Brazil. Brazil's economy during the colonial period was primarily based on agriculture, with sugar, cotton, and coffee being the major export crops. The mining of gold and diamonds in the 18th century also contributed significantly to Brazil's economic output and attracted a large influx of settlers. Slave labor, primarily from Africa, was extensively used in plantations and mines, forming the backbone of the colonial economy. By the early 19th century, Brazil had the largest slave population in the Americas, estimated at around 1 million individuals. The colonial society was highly stratified, similar to uh, New Spain, with a small European elite at the top, followed by free people of mixed racial backgrounds and enslaved Africans at the bottom. The Catholic Church played a significant role in colonial Brazil, with Jesuits establishing missions, reduções, to convert and educate indigenous populations. Racial mixing between Europeans, Africans, and indigenous led to the development of a complex and diverse society. The emergence of a native-born elite, Mazombos, with a distinct identity from the Portuguese-born elite, Renois, contributed to growing tensions and desires for autonomy. Thank you so much. Any questions? Don't hesitate to send me an email. Take care of yourselves all. Bye bye.